Okay, so now that we have a clear understanding of how to do global illumination for stills, we need to understand how to do this for animation. And there are some key problems that we encounter with animation that we're going to go over this chapter and probably find some solutions on us in the next couple chapters. So let's first start exploring this, as we like to do, in a very simple scene. So here's a very simple scene, and we've got basically have a camera move with these little sort of dominoes sort of lined up in this area, and the camera move just sort of rotates around this scene, and we have this sort of back area here that that provides some bounce for global illumination. And what else do we have? If I go into perspective view, I'll see that I have basically just one big GI light up there. That's an area light, a V-ray light. And in terms of rendering, all I'm really doing is I've got my environment override in just a white sky, and I'm also doing a medium irradiance map. I'm actually in direct illumination is irradiance map, and the secondary bounces is quasi Monte Carlo. And I'm doing a medium setting. As you know, I just go with these default presets just for comparison's sake, but when you usually would fine-tune this once you start getting better at these values. And then I'm also doing, notice I turned these down quite a bit. There's a reason for that. It's actually hard for me to illustrate my point with very simple scenes sometimes on using the default values. So I actually lowered them a little bit because it's actually hard to get the artifacts that I want to try to illustrate with it. So, but anyway, this is going to be plenty for us to show. So I'm basically lowered these hemispheric samples to 15, and then my interpolated samples down to 10, and all that does is it blurs these samples less when we're actually looking at them in all respect to each other. Okay, so now that we've done that, I'm just going to go ahead back to my camera view. I'm just going to render this first frame here and see what we get. So I go ahead and render, and we will notice then it just goes through the first 3 passes. I'm not doing the show samples, I'm just going right to it. And it goes ahead and renders it, and it looks just fine. And at first glance on a still, you'd say, wow, that looks, there's nothing really wrong with it. But you do notice a little bit of an issue, and such as these fine sort of splotchy areas here and in this area, and you definitely notice them down on this area in here. So it says it rendered in 23 seconds, but there's actually some slowdown from capturing this video, which I'm doing. So I'd say it's probably going to be maybe half that when I'm actually doing the real renders. So what I've gone ahead and done is I've done a full render of this full 100 frames, and I'm going to just load that up in the RAM player here in 3D Studio, and we can scrub through it. So why don't I go ahead and load that. All right, so I've loaded it, and one thing I want to note is that when you actually there's a high-end version or a full version of this that you'll be able to see. The capturing process can't really show you this really playing properly, so I would definitely refer to the animation that's on this DVD to get a better idea of exactly what's going to really see it. But if you look at these little fine splotches, I'm trying to sort of scrub through this. You will notice that they swim all over the place. You can see it in this area here. And then if you look down here, obviously it's even worse. It gets really sort of bad in that area. So just that is part of the problem with animation, is that it tends to create these artifacts that are just, they just get all noisy and everything else. And they're visible when you actually show them in the animation. All right, so well, one thing I also want you to notice before we go through there is the fact that the rendering times are fairly low. So keep that in mind. We're about 17, 19 frames a second, something like that. So as low as 15 at some points. So, you know, think about that in terms of your average rendering time, but that's really good rendering time, obviously not good enough for this animation because we have all this noise. So we kind of have to solve this by, there's a few ways we're going to solve it. And the first obvious way that we know how to solve this is to bump up our settings. So we're just going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to take my rendering, and I'm going to go into my irradiance map, and I'm going to switch this to high. So we're going to do a higher density samples. notice that, you know, obviously now our splotches gone away. We know that, and just things just generally look a little smoother. And we do see a little bit of things going on here, but barely. So let's just go ahead and load up the animation, which I've already done, and we can see what that looks like. So let me go ahead and load that for you guys. All right, so it's now all loaded, and we'll notice that, wow, that's looks pretty good. You don't really see any noise, but for our purposes, and again, I would tell you I would refer to the larger, to the higher res animation that will be on this DVD, the full version. You'll notice if you look right in these areas here, we still have a bit of a problem. And I'll just scrub through it real slow, and you'll see that there is some swimming and some gobbledygook going on in there. And some people would find that's just fine, but for our purposes, we're going to say that's not good enough. And we're going to look at a way to, how do you deal with that? And there's one key thing to look at in terms of this scene, and so we'll talk about that next. Oh, but just one last thing before we do that is I want to mention that we have 43 seconds now. So we've gone up anywhere from 2 to 3 times as long a rendering time, which is something we sacrificed by just pumping up our settings, and not always a good thing for animations. So again, let's look at this scene, like I was saying, in one key concept about it. And the key concept about it is that it is a moving camera. Okay, that is the only thing that is animated in this scene. Is nothing else is animated. No materials are animated. No objects are animated. No lights are animated. The only thing that is going on is a camera. And you're wondering, well, how often that does happen? And in fact, the matter is, it happens very often for digital sets or any kind of reveal shots, etc. Usually, you will have, you know, just a camera move, and that will be just fine. So, just simple camera moves for digital sets is something that happens quite often, and for those situations, we actually have some solutions. And we're going to look into that. And the fact is, we can actually bake in the lighting into our scene. And I'm going to show you guys one quick way of doing it. And there's actually several ways of doing it, but I'm going to show you one quick way in terms of doing it with respect. Frame 1 here, or frame 0. So let's go ahead and render it. Okay, so now that it's rendered, and just one thing you want to note is that what's going on here is you'll notice we've sort of been looking at this top part of the irradiance map, and we haven't sort of ignored this part here. And you'll notice there's something called a irradiance map, and how many samples it's taken, and how many bytes the whole thing takes, and what that is in megabytes. So notice there's actually tells you how many samples are. Well, and if you look here, and it says on render n, don't delete. It has actually saved the irradiance map in memory. So I'm going to go ahead and do save to file. And when I do that, I'm going to just type in view 01 or something like that. And I'm going to save it. And then I'm going to go here and I'm going to load it from file. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to load view 1 here. And when I do that, it's no longer going to calculate the irradiance map. And as you know, that's probably the longest process of the render. So it's just going to go ahead and render it. And so let's just go ahead and do render now as we've loaded this. And we'll see that, boom, it's going right into the render. And even with the capture process, instead of taking, 40-something seconds, it's going to, go very, very, very quickly. So let's just let it finish. I'll probably do another version. Yeah, it's 16 seconds. I'm going to go ahead and render this again without capturing by hitting the pause, just to give a more accurate look at what we're doing here. So I'm going to hit render one more time, but I'll pause the video. All right, that didn't make a huge difference, 15 seconds. But anyway, we're back at the speed that we had for our medium sort of bad settings where we had all that noise, but now we have it saved, so it's actually looking good. So we've actually saved ourselves quite a bit of rendering time by saving out the irradiance map. Now here's the problem. Let's go and sort of advance through, and I'm going to look at it from like, you know, about halfway through, and go ahead and we've got all kinds of funky stuff going on in here, all kinds of noise and stuff going on back here, and there's all kinds of problems. And there's actually a good explanation for this, and I'm going to go ahead and pull that up. So let me show you what I mean. All right, so what we do know about the irradiance map is that it's captured from the camera. So we know that this is a different angle camera, so it's not correct. But the data that actually a irradiance map is actually three-dimensional data. It's point cloud data. So by being point cloud data, one of the tools that the people over at V-Ray has written is called this irradiance map viewer, and it's just sort of a little freebie tool that they offer on their website. But and you can, if you sort of go in there, I'm going to go ahead and sort of make the view. You can sort of almost see where it was captured from the camera. You can actually say, oh, gap of data back in this area, which is kind of what we did when we tried to render there, and that's why we have all these weird artifacts and we don't have anything going on in this area here, and just things just only look bad. Do the following. We are going to go in, and I'm going to do the following. I'm going to render using a perspective camera. I'm going to just go ahead and do 4 renders of this particular scene, right? Sort of 1 from each angle. So I'm going to do 1 about like this, 2, 3, 4. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then I'm going to show you guys the results inside of that irradiance map viewer so you guys can get a good idea what's going on. So why don't I just pause this video, and then we'll come back when all those irradiance maps are done. And they usually take very little time, so just for you know, just to show you, to speed the process up, I'm going to pause the video. All right, so we've gone through that and rendered all 4, and they were taking about 26 seconds or so to render. So let's go back to our irradiance map viewer, and I'm going to go ahead and open them, and I have part 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I'm going to open up part 1, and I will notice that, you know, again, I have a pretty good got this problem here. So what I can do is, considering the fact that I've done part 1, 2, 3, and 4, is I can actually go in here, and you see in this file, I can actually do merge, and I'll merge part 2. And by doing that, I've actually taken 2 of them and sort of put them together, which is a great solution to our problem. Oops. There we go. So you can see they're sort of merged them together, and they become denser in here, and so we've got sort of a better look. But back here, so I'm going to go ahead and just do merge 3 and then merge 4, and I've done that, and so now I see all 4, and it seems that I've got everything I need for what we want, and that looks pretty good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and save parts merged. I'm going to save that, and I'm going to go ahead and look at this back in camera view, And I'm going to go and remember we had done the view 1. I'm going to do parts merged and look at that. So render from file. And I'm going to render this from file here. And you'll notice that our problem errors are almost gone. There's still a few weird things going on here, it looks like. But for the most part, our problem errors are gone. If I render this, this won't swim because it's baked in. So that those weird little artifacts will stay put. But as I just said, I'm noticing some few little sort of odd things going on here, and here it may not be as dense as I want. There's splotchy there, and it's just kind of not exactly right. But it is rendering. Ahead and start by, looking at these sort of like this, and I'm going to do 4 more renders, so it'll be part 5 through 8. So I'm going to go ahead and do those parts. Alright, so we're done, and what we got here is we've got basically our 4 views because they're on the closer in on the geometry and all the detail. They're at about 45 seconds per render. So we've done all 4, and let's go back to our Radiance map viewer. And as you remember, this is kind of what it looked like. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and merge in the more detailed version of it. So we'll start with stuff, and we're just going to keep going along and keep merging in part 6, part 7, and part 8. And we'll see now that basically we have all this nice detail in all these little things that are going on here that might have taken care of all the problems we had with our last merged map. So we're going to go ahead and save this and save it as merged 2. On frame 50, so let's go back to our camera point of view, and we're going to render out frame 50. And as you remember, we had all kinds of little artifact problems in these areas, and they seem to have gone away because we probably have collected additional detail that we needed. And of course, by doing so, our rendering times are down again to about 17 seconds, which is great. So let's sort of think this through a little bit more. What we're actually doing is we're going in and we're starting from scratch every view, adding more samples. But what if we could be a little bit smarter and sort of let V-Ray learn from what it had already captured to capturing some new stuff? So that's actually what we're going to do. So let's try one more strategy in terms of collecting this detail area. So we'll go back to our perspective view here, and we'll sort of do that in terms of the map. And everything else is the same. The only other thing I'm going to do is under the global switches here, I have this ability to do not render final image. And all that's really going to do, it's going to collect the radiance map, do all the pre-rendering, but not actually do the rendering because we don't really care about the rendering. All we care about is the radiance map, which is kind of going to save us some time. So let's just go ahead and do these renders. And I'm just going to do one here. And as you go through, notice it's going through the process of step 1 out of 4, etc., etc. So it's going through that process. And as it's getting towards the end here, you'll be able to see what the rendering time is. So I'm just going to let it finish. The next ones, I'm just going to pause the video between them. So let it just finish up its render here. All right. And it took 33 seconds to collect that map. And it didn't render the image. As you notice, nothing's changed. It's just tried to burn in a time, but that's because that's what it's doing. So 33 seconds for the first one. Okay. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to now go to our next view, which is this. And when doing that, I'm going to go in here, and instead of doing the single frame, I'm going to do incremental add to current map. And what that does is it remembers what's already in memory, because remember we have don't delete, and it'll continue to add what it can to where it needs it. So it's kind of a little bit smart in terms of the way it is, because it's already going to remember what it knows, and it's going to keep adding to it, but not sort of start from scratch. It already remembers some of the other detail. And let's sort of go through this process, and you'll see how that affects our rendering times as we go through this. So I'm going to go ahead and render again, and I'm going to pause it. So I'm going to pause, and you'll notice now it's gone down to 26 seconds to add the second map. So let's just keep going with this process, and you'll sort of see what I'm talking about. So I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to get this view, and about the same, but I keep going by a quarter. And I'm just going to add another one. So I'm going to go ahead and render one more here. I'm going to pause again, and it's at 28 seconds. And let's see if we get another one here. I'm going to try that one more time. So let's do that a little bit. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and render this one, and pause again. And notice now it's at 22 seconds. And we're actually just going to keep going, just to keep showing this pattern that happens. Down and down and down, because we're already filled in most of the holes that we need. So it's got all of this in memory right now, and it'll tell you here, it's basically you got 7.3 megs of this whole big process. So I'm going to go ahead and save that to a map, and I'm going to call it detail here. So parts detail, I'm going to go ahead and save that, and I'm going to go back to my Radiance map viewer. And remember, this is the one that's all merged, and we're actually going to go back a version and go back to the old merge one, which was just the low detailed one. And I'm going to go ahead and merge in this parts detail, which is essentially 5 through 8, but all done sort of within the render. I'm going to go ahead and do that, and you'll see that we basically have our same very detailed and so by doing that, now I'm going to save that to let's go back to our viewer, and we'll do a save, and we'll call it merge 3. Okay, so let's go ahead and do merge 3 and save that right now. All right, so now that we've done that, let's go ahead and do a render, and we'll go ahead and load merge 3. And we will go ahead and do a render with what's in the, basically doing the whole process based on what's in the map. You got to also remember that if you're going to do that, you have to go to your frame, to your global switches, and remember to actually do the render. So we're going to go ahead and render and see what goes on from there. All right, so I've actually gone ahead and loaded the whole sequence in RAM, and we notice we're back down to it looked like our high density one, but we were having some swimming problems around here where the noise was kind of swimming around. But because we've baked it all into one map, and sort of the light has all kind of gotten baked into our process here, and as I actually go through here, you'll notice that the samples or the noise doesn't really move. That's because it's baked in. And that's kind of an important thing to remember, is that this process will sort of keep everything intact and the lighting won't change. So it's a real advantage. So even if you had a low density baking or radiance map that you've done, it won't move when you animate it if you were able to bake it in, which is kind of a real advantage, because sometimes when you're doing textures you don't necessarily need a super high quality radiance map, because the textures seem to hide a lot of the artifacts. So you just need a lower density one and you can get away with a lot more. So that's kind of a good thing to have. So baking it all in is a good process, and we should. That's kind of what we're going to be covering as different methods of baking. But one strategy I want to talk about is, if you look back at our radiance map viewer, we've actually gotten way. I know that our animation kind of goes around this way. Collected a lot of stuff in the same way that, you know, a photon mapping or a radiosity solution sort of does everything. We don't really need it, so we can actually be smarter and more strategic about how we do our radiance map collection, and that's kind of what we're going to be covering on our next chapters.